My name is Dylan, and I don't like writing automated tests. Hello, Dylan. Thank you. I've also been at Puppet for about 4.5 years as a professional services engineer, and I'm now managing the professional services team out of EMEA. So, as I said, I don't like writing tests. And there are some reasons for it. When you're writing aspect tests, for those of you that have written them, a lot of the time you're writing the test and it really just looks like you're rewriting the Puppet code in a different language. You're saying this package Apache should be present, and then I want to check that package Apache is present, and it's kind of the same thing. Even to the point where there is a tool, Retrospec, which is written by Corey, who's around here somewhere, which will actually take Puppet code and turn it into aspect tests. And when you see that happen, you're like, what? Why have I been writing aspect tests this entire time? If I can just generate them from the code, what's the point? And that's just for writing modules. Once you start writing profiles and roles and you're testing against them, it feels even more redundant to be like, what do I even test? A profile has so much stuff in it, and a role has even more, that I'm not even sure where to start. And so at least that's how I was feeling. Now, to be fair, automated testing of modules is not redundant, and you should definitely do it. Retrospec is a really good way to get started. But when you're writing a module, you're writing something that is designed to be reusable, and people are going to pass crazy stuff to it, and you want to make sure that it works, regardless of the crazy stuff that people pass to it. But when you're writing profiles and roles, you're not going to apply your IIS web server role to a Solaris box. And nobody else is going to use it either because it's relative to your business. So it is less relevant when you're writing roles and profiles. But it turns out that there's one neat trick that allows you to get to 100% test coverage without actually writing any tests or doing very much work. And so I'm going to tell you a bit about what that is. Just test your roles. That's the trick. The idea being, for those of you that don't know about roles and profiles, when you're using the roles and profiles pattern, every node gets one role. That role then includes profiles, and a profile is how your company does X, where X is the name of the profile. So I'm talking about profile monitoring. It's how our company does monitoring. And that's going to pull some information from Hira. For example, it might pull which Splunk forwarder should I forward stuff to based on which data center I'm in. And it's going to pass that opinionated information down to component modules, which are generic, like the generic Splunk forwarder module, which then contains resources which actually end up in the catalog, which actually does the work. But it's kind of like a big pyramid of one-to-many relationships where one role includes many profiles, profiles include many component modules include many resources, and that's what's in the catalog. So in theory, and because nodes only get one role, in theory, if you test every role, you should have covered every permutation of what your code does. And so that's it. That's how to do automated testing the easy way. I was going to just stop for questions here, but I figured that the first question would be, how do I do this? So we'll talk a little bit about the how. Firstly, if you've ever written a test before, this is what it looks like over on the left. This is an aspect test. This is the simplest test that you could possibly write. It says, this class, when it works, it is expected to compile. You can write more complicated ones, but this is the simplest one. It basically just means that the Puppet code will actually compile into a catalog and it won't have any errors or cyclic dependencies or whatever it is. But what do we actually need in order to run that? I can't just point RSpec at this file with nothing else and expect it to work. I need to provide it with some extra information. What are the requirements? Someone give me one requirement that Aspect would need to work. Facts. This one actually already has facts. It only has one. It's probably going to need more than one. But facts is a really good example. If you have a role that calls out to a profile, that calls out to a module that is meant to work on Windows and Linux, it's going to need to know whether it's Windows or Linux for it to work. So you need to provide those facts. What's something else? Higher data, especially if you're using roles and profiles. Higher data is probably going to be necessary. Like that Splunk forwarder example, if you try and run your monitoring profile against a server that doesn't have any higher data, it's not going to be able to find what the Splunk forwarder is, so it's not going to be able to set it, so it's not going to be able to compile. Similarly, you can't tell it where the higher data is without higher config, so you need that as well. The other thing that you're going to need is dependencies. You need to tell it where the thing you're testing actually is. So as I've said, we're just going to be testing roles, and that's it. You've got to tell it where the roles are. And you also have to tell it where all of the other modules are. Chances are you've got a lot of modules that you use from the Forge, from internally. You've got to tell it where that stuff is. Once we've done all these things, though, we can run this test. And so the next question becomes, where is this stuff? We need it, so let's go and find it. Where are facts? Where do they come from? Aspect file, factor DB. Where do they actually come from initially, though? Nodes. Factor from the nodes. You can put them in a bunch of different places, but initially they come from the nodes. Now, where the module actually is, your roles typically live in your control repo, along with your profiles, along with normally your higher data. Normally all that stuff lives in a control repo, but if it doesn't, it's probably listed in the Puppet file, which tells it where to go and find it, and the Puppet file lives in the control repo. The dependencies live in the Puppet file, which lives in the control repo, and the hieroconfig lives in the control repo, unless you're using Hiero 3, which hopefully you're not. But as long as it's 4 and 5, it lives in the control repo. Which means that the only thing that we need to do this that doesn't already exist in the control repo is the facts. Everything else is already there. It's in weird places that Aspect is not expecting, but it's there. So really, all we actually need to do is go and get facts off the systems and then put them in the control repo, and then theoretically we can run this test. There's going to be some plumbing to get it to actually work, and we're going to have to decide what to run the test on and how many tests to run and stuff like that. But the dependencies are there. So the solution to that question of all of the plumbing, what do we do with all the plumbing? Onceover is the answer to that. Onceover is an automated testing tool for control repos that is designed to test roles. It can be used in other situations if you don't use roles and profiles and things like that, but it's certainly much better at testing a role inside of a control repo. What it consists of is one big config file that looks like this, which is actually a bit hard to read, I apologize. But essentially, in the config file, we list all of our roles that we want to test, which we can see up the top section. There's some Linux ones, some Windows ones. Then we list all of the nodes that we want to test them on. Now these aren't actual nodes, they're facts from a CentOS 5, CentOS 6, CentOS 7 machine. Onceover does actually come with some built-in facts, but they're normally wrong because normally you rely on your own custom facts. Like the Splunk example again, I can't determine which Splunk forwarder I need unless I know what data center I'm in, which is not a built-in fact. So probably you're going to need your own. To gather them, you just run Puppet facts and it outputs JSON, and then you put the JSON in the control repo and then you give it the name here. So it's not very complicated, but it's something that you've got to do once. So we've got the roles, we've got the facts to test them against, and all of the rest of the config file is just mapping them to each other. Which roles should we test against which fact sets? There's a concept of groups just to make life a bit easier because lots of people have hundreds of roles. So there is some class groups here. So I'm using our naming convention, which has Linux and Windows in the role name, to split them into a group for Linux and a group for Windows. And then for the nodes, I've just got a list of Windows nodes, and then the Linux nodes is actually a group made up of other groups dynamically. So it is actually all of the nodes minus these two Windows nodes. So I'm doing like kind of dynamic creating of a group based on another group, which you can do if you need to. Otherwise, you can just list it. If you don't have many like this, you can just list it. The final part is the test matrix, which basically just says, on my Linux nodes, test my Linux roles. On my Windows nodes, test my Windows roles. And that is all it is. There's no other config or anything. It's just this. So at this point, I'm ready to run. I'm going to do a live demo, but I have a canned demo just in case that doesn't work. Which it quite possibly won't, but we'll be fine. So I'm inside, that's too small. I'm inside my control repo here. It's a regular control repo. I've got my site folder. I've got a Puppet file. I've got the kind of stuff that you expect in there. The HIRA data is in there. I've also got some roles. So if I look in site role manifests, I've got a Jenkins role, a metrics role, a MySQL role, a whole bunch of roles like you would expect. I've also got a onceover.yaml file under spec onceover.yaml. Inside of this, we've got my roles, but instead of listing them all out, I'm just using a regular expression to say anything that is called role. I'm just going to use as a role because it's easier. I've then got some nodes and some groups and stuff like that. It's not super relevant for this example. And finally, I have a test matrix which assigns nodes to fact sets, or roles to fact sets. So what I'm going to do is run the tests and it should work. So if I run bundle exec onceover run spec, what this is going to do is first, it needs to go and get all the dependencies because in the control repo is just the roles and the profiles. I have a whole bunch of other stuff I need, which it needs to go and get. So it's going to do that first by using R10K to look at the Puppet file and pull all of that in. It will hopefully pull that stuff off the forge if the internet works, which it does. And then it's going to, for each role, compile a catalog against whatever fact sets were configured for that role. And it's going to print out a little green P if it passes or a little red F if it fails. You can see some have more tests than others because they're designed to run on more operating systems than others. And so it's done. Everything has worked. But testing isn't very helpful unless you can prove that it will pick up a failure. So what I'm now going to do is break something and then make sure it actually picks it up. So if I go into site profile manifest Jenkins plugins, this is just a profile called Jenkins plugins, installs a bunch of Jenkins plugins. It is presumably included in the Jenkins role, but I don't really know. It might be included in other roles, doesn't really matter. And what I'm going to do is break it by removing that comma, and then it should fail, or something should fail. You'll remember that when I ran onceover run spec last time, it didn't actually test the Jenkins profile. I'm going to run it in parallel so it's a bit faster. It only tested the roles, but because the roles include all the profiles and the profiles include everything else, I can break anything downstream and it will cause at least one role to not compile as long as that thing is actually used. If I break something I don't use, then it won't fail. And so we can see here, we've got a couple of failed tests. We've got a syntax error at handlebars, which if I have a look in my file here, at line 6, handlebars, which is because I'm missing the comma just here. So if I add this back, run it again, theoretically, everything should pass. Then that's quite a simple syntax error. This shouldn't take too long. It's quite a simple syntax error, but it will also pick up cyclic dependencies, incorrect data types, incorrect parameters passed to resources or profiles, anything that would typically cause a catalog to fail. We can see here it's passed, and it'll pick that up from anywhere. So if somebody upstream has updated a module that is now broken, if some other team that I'm relying on has updated their module, which is now broken for my use case, this will pick that up because we don't have to test the module, we just have to test the role that includes the profile that includes the module. So that was a pretty simple demo of writing one config file and then testing absolutely all of my Puppet code. And you're probably skeptical, and you would be right to be a bit skeptical. It's normally not this easy. I'm sure that you can think of some reason why your Puppet code that you have wouldn't be able to compile on some laptop right here. There are many reasons. One good reason is I'm using a function which hits an external API, which is not available because I'm on a plane. And even if I wasn't on a plane, it wouldn't be available because I don't have VPN. And if I even did have VPN, it wouldn't be available because I don't have credentials. Or I'm doing a Puppet DB query, which is a good example of this. If we have functions like that that need to be run on the master or need to be run in some particular environment, we can just fake them. There is a section in the config file called functions, and we can see here we've got the Puppet DB query function. We've just told it to return an array. And so every time that function is called as part of compiling any of the catalogs, it's going to just return that. And it's not actually going to call the function. So it's not actually going to try and reach out over the network and do anything and therefore fail. Another pretty obvious one is eYAML. eYAML pulls encrypted data from Hiera and decrypts it using private keys, which you shouldn't have on your laptop. Ideally, nobody should have, or it should be backed up somewhere, but very, very locked down. So not being able to have the private key means that you can't decrypt anything, which means that all of your lookups fail because it can't find the private key. So the solution to that is just turn it off. Just don't use eYAML. And normally as a PSE, I wouldn't give that advice, but you can turn it off for just testing. You leave it on for actual production, but just when you're testing, it'll just use the YAML backend. The YAML backend still works, of course, with eYAML because eYAML is just taking this encrypted stuff, noticing it's encrypted, decrypting it, passing it back. The YAML backend is stupid, so it doesn't decrypt it, but it still passes back a string. So for the purposes of compiling a catalog, it's still a string, it's a longer string, but it's still a string, so chances are it's still going to work, unless you're doing some kind of verification that the password is 10 characters or something like that. It's still going to work, it's just going to be a different password. The other one is if you're relying on the Puppet Enterprise classes, if you're using Puppet Enterprise to configure Puppet Enterprise, those classes don't exist in your roles, so you will have to mock them. Same with if you're using any kind of custom setup where, let's say you have a baseline compliance class, which is applied to everything, and then they also have a role on top of it. You need that baseline compliance class to exist when it's compiling so you can reference it and things like that. So what we do to get around that issue is there is a tool called preconditions, or not really a tool, it's just a folder called preconditions. And you stick Puppet code in there, and it gets evaluated during every single catalog compile. So it exists in the catalog compilation so that you can access its variables and reference its resources and all that kind of stuff. So how do you get started? You go to my repo, github.com/DylanRatcliffe/Onceover. That's got all the documentation, and it will tell you to gem install Onceover and then run Onceover init. This generates all the config, the directories, it generates some README files, everything you need to get started. If you then run bundle exec onceover run spec, all the tests will run. They'll probably all fail because you're using Puppet DB query or eYAML or some other reason that you're going to have to mock to get them to work, but they will run after just doing this. If you have a control repo, download this, Onceover init, bundle exec if you want to. You don't have to use bundler, and then Onceover run spec, and everything will run. And that's basically it. The best way to get started is just get started. All the tests will fail, and then go into the config and start, removing Solaris or whatever OSs you don't use and start actually sorting it out properly. Because when it generates the config, it just says, I'm going to test everything against everything. So you'll have to obviously change that. But just get started. It will take a little while to get the tests passing, but once they're passing and you have a config file that uses like regular expressions for roles, you don't have to touch the config file when you generate a new profile or add a new module. And you don't even have to touch it when you add a new role because it's just using regular expressions. So you can test everything without writing any tests, and you don't have to change anything as you write new stuff as well. One thing that I wanted to give a bit of a sneak preview of here is Onceover 4, which will be coming out when I get time. Which I was really hoping would be today, but I didn't get time. So it's almost done, but it's not done. And basically, Onceover 4 re-implements acceptance testing. There's a few people in the room that used Onceover back in the day when it had acceptance testing, which was backed by Beaker. And it was such a horrible, horrible hack that I knew that people would start submitting GitHub issues for it. And so I pulled it out, and I was like, I'll come back to this and do it properly. I'm coming back to it and doing it properly. It's built on the same technology as Litmus, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to use your existing config where you have certain roles mapped to certain operating systems, and then you will also tell it which Docker container or Vagrant VM or VM pooler image to use to spin up a real machine. And so it'll spin up a real machine, install Puppet, copy all the code on, run Puppet to make sure that everything works, it doesn't fail, run Puppet again to make sure it's idempotent, and then destroy the machine. You can also create custom virtualization providers because it uses the same backend as Litmus. You can put in a pull request to that and it'll work for both. I encourage somebody to write a backend for LDOMs or zones or VMware or something like that. VMware is probably more likely, but LDOMs and zones would be cool. You can quickly build a testing environment to poke around, so you'll be able to, instead of just saying, all right, run this entire giant suite of tests that takes 4 hours, which it probably will, by the way, instead of that, just say, all right, I'm working on the Jenkins role, so build me a Jenkins server and get to the point of running Puppet, but then don't destroy it afterwards, and then just give me credentials to log in, like a Vagrant environment, except it's dynamically generated from the config file, and you can run tests. You'll also be able to run your own predefined acceptance tests, so you can just do it in like stupid mode where it just runs stuff and then shuts it down. But if you want to actually check that the server that was built was correct, you'll be able to do that as well. And configurable amounts of parallelism. So if you're running it on your own machine, you can run 4 machines at a time or 6 machines at a time. Or if you have VMware or VM pooler under the hood, you can run 50, 60, 70 machines at a time. The reason that I've done this, there certainly will be some people for which building a machine once and then destroying it will not sufficiently replicate their real environment, especially in highly regulated places, banks, that sort of thing. There's a lot of stuff going on that you just can't test in a once-off, or you can, but it would be a hell of a lot of work. But it certainly will give you a fair amount of coverage for things like, oh, I've told it to install Apache version 12, and that's syntactically valid. It compiles into a catalog, but there is no Apache version 12, so it doesn't work. And so the idea is it'll cover those kinds of use cases. If you're interested in this, follow the GitHub project. It will be released soon, hopefully. If you've got ideas for it, there is a GitHub project under Onceover, a project called Automated Testing. You can add tickets to that. It's kind of mostly done. This is a screenshot of it. It does actually build stuff and work. There's just a little bit of polish that needs to be done to it. I'm happy to demo it if anybody is interested after this or outside, or just catch me somewhere. But it does exist, it's just not quite done. So, does anyone have any questions?
We've got, oh, you turned me off. Are we live? Oh, hold that question for a second.
I was wondering how you can use a Onceover in a control repo where you don't have role classes, but you maybe classify everything in your manifest IPP, and so you manage everything from there based on facts and IRA and whatever.
So if you classify everything as site.pp, Onceover doesn't look at site.pp. It deliberately ignores it because chances are if you're doing stuff like classifying on facts, you're doing it in there, and you probably don't want Onceover to do that because all the host names are going to be wrong and it's just not going to work. If you're using something that is similar to roles and profiles in that every node gets one class, which then goes on to everything, I would recommend just not trying to integrate it with site.pp and just use the config file. Just say include this role, and that's it. If it gets many classes, so like it's, there's multiple sets of conditional logic to say, if it's in the DMZ, then add the extra security hardening, and if it's Windows, then add this, and if it's a web server, then do this. I don't have a good answer for you other than probably move to roles and profiles. It really does rely on having kind of one entry point for everything, which in the case of roles and profiles is a role, and possibly it exists depending on your use case, but it's much harder to use if you don't have one entry point.
Okay, we got 3 minutes. Any final questions? You're waving your hand. There you go.
I was going to bug Dylan about it later. One of the things that Onceover's awesome at is, one of the many things, is the fact that you can use your own custom facts for the machines that you've got. I've done a little bit of a wrapper around like a script to go out and refresh those facts. Any thoughts on actually being able to use something like a direct PuppetDB query to pull the facts out based on some classification rules?
Yes, so you were sitting at the wrong table at the hackathon. There is work going on.
Everyone else was sitting at the wrong table. I was sitting at the right table.
We're working on that. I am accepting proposals of how that would look without making the config file horrible is basically what I'm most concerned about, but I think it's a good idea.
I'm going to make you repeat that. I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you've used Octofacts, because it seems like it does a lot of what you're talking about, like pull facts from your actual hosts out of the PuppetDB, and you can do all kinds of stuff with them with your tests.
I haven't used Octofacts. I didn't know about Octofacts. I've deliberately not used FactorDB, mostly because while FactorDB has a whole bunch of facts, it doesn't have custom facts, and you can add custom facts programmatically on top of like, give me some CentOS ones and then add some extra stuff on it and stuff like that. But while it's a little bit ugly to just maintain a directory of 20 JSON files, it is very simple. And I've yet to see a proposal that was enough. It definitely would be better to do that, but not better enough to justify making the config file more complex and making the injection of those facts more complex. I've yet to see a solution for it, but it's coming up more and more. And so I probably would consider adding some kind of configurable backend for the facts as long as it didn't make the config file horrible.